I think we're ready to start now. Apologies for the delay. That's something to do with the recording. My name is Alex Ding, and this is my collaborator and friend, Ian Bruce. And today we have got you here together to talk about silo busting. And this is a very unusual presentation for us, because normally Ian is super prepared and I am mildly prepared, and we talk about work that we've already done. This is basically a talk where we're going to go through the process of work that's to be done. So it's very much work in progress. It's based on a number of things which I'd like to just go through very briefly. Sorry, I'll do it in. That's not working. Oh, bloody hell. As you say, it's very much work in progress. We have one slide, apparently. There we go. Nothing like a bit of technical problems to settle the nerves. Anyway, the basis of this talk is around things that we wrote in our book in 2017, Operating on the Edge of Academia, which often gets cited, and as my colleagues keep telling me, only cited because of the title rather than the content. But there are two things that we left in that book that were unanswered. And the work that we've done since then is trying to work out the consequences of that. One of them is the main focus of this talk, which we'll go into more detail in a little bit, but it was to do with Ferguson's understanding of the dimensions of the knowledge base for EAP. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's basically three dimensions to do with the linguistic components, the kind of epistemological aspects of disciplines, and the social, political, anthropological. Those are the three basic categories. And in our book, we said pretty much that knowledge base consists of those three dimensions. We didn't think much more beyond that at that point. The second aspect, which I'll come back to right at the end of the talk, is about ethics. And I think the last sentence in that book was around trying to reduce the gap between the real and the ideal as being the main motivator of scholarship in EAP for practitioners. And so ethics underpins all of our investigations. And we left it at that. As one of my colleagues here mentioned, you know, I tend to operate on the idea that I'm kind of like the vicar of EAP. You know, you kind of send out nice messages like that without really substantiating them at all. So we were kind of left with those two aspects, and every week, every Sunday, me and Ian meet. Ian works in New Zealand. We meet on Skype and we spend an hour talking about these kinds of things. So it really is trying to work through some of the inconsistencies and lacuna in our own work. We've tried to develop it further by publishing with others different books, and one of them was with Michelle Evans, where we edited a book on social theory in EAP to look at one dimension of the knowledge base. Ian wrote a chapter in that on social realism, and I wrote a chapter on Bourdieu and the impact of field analysis to understand EAP. We've tried to do it as our own work. We've got our own coherence to our work, but also working in conjunction with, for example, B. Bond and Ian edited a book on policy and politics in EAP. So we try to draw in as many practitioners and many other voices into this kind of chorus of a conversation around where EAP could go. Yeah. So just a quick reminder, Ferguson wrote this very obscure paper that's actually not very interesting, apart from a paragraph in it where he identifies EAP knowledge base as being discipline and values, culture, epistemology, and what we call discourse and genre analysis. So that's just a brief reminder. However, this is where we're at the moment. This also forms the basis of our thinking around a new MA in teaching English for academic purposes we're developing at Leeds. So all of what I'm trying to say is all of the conversations that we have are embedded in all sorts of other conversations in the field with colleagues, with practitioners, etc. And what we noticed with Ferguson's framework was, if you look to the right, this is outward facing towards the disciplines and fields that we teach and we investigate. So you've got those three dimensions, and what we noticed was that they exist discretely. You have people who look at genre and discourse, you have people who look at epistemologies, and you have people who look at disciplinary cultures, but they don't really talk to themselves amongst themselves. The relationship between the three is quite unclear. That was one main problem that we were trying to get to grips with. How can you have a theoretical heuristic? We wouldn't go as far as to say a theory wouldn't, you know, we hopefully develop it into something coherent, but how would you explain how academic writing or communication is impacted by the epistemologies of the disciplines or the interdisciplinary field, and how does that enveloped within social forces and structures that shape research? So you've got, if you like, not exactly causal, but you've got relationships that go up from language to society, and you've also got the other way coming down. So how is academic language enveloped in cultures, in structures, and so on? So that was our basic fundamental question. The additional advantage of trying to look at it this way was to look at it going towards that side, the left, where we're looking at, in this case, a kind of aspect of reflexivity towards the field of EAP. So in other words, what are the genres and discourses of EAP? What are the epistemologies of EAP? And what are the kind of social forces and cultures that shape us as a field? So the work we're doing this way ought to serve for a greater reflexivity around what we do and understanding our own production of academic communication. The thing in the middle, the ill-defined field of English for academic purposes, is that EAP as a field has very porous boundaries. We have Kaplan, we have librarians, we have all sorts of agents in the field. We have big testing bodies. We have all sorts of people that, in a sense, interfere in our practices. So with Letitia tomorrow, me and her are going to be talking about how do you analyze the field. So one of the interesting things is, if we're trying to establish the relationship between us as practitioners and how we understand the field, we also need to understand the slightly precarious and slightly odd position that we operate within the field. So it's a very, very complicated system of relationships. So we now get to the introduction. This won't last this long, okay? We put this in here deliberately. So we're going to be talking about current approaches to academic language in EAP, some of the constraints on the EAP practitioner in terms of the knowledge base and research, a little bit more about Ferguson, and then some implications. So when we look at approaches to academic language in EAP, it's fairly clear from any kind of conference or collection of papers or edited books, there is a huge diversity around understandings of what constitutes the knowledge base of EAP. And this is something you see at this conference, you see everywhere. Now, whether that's a major issue or not is open to question. But one of the problems of a fragile knowledge base is that the field becomes slightly fractured, slightly diverse. It's very difficult to make a more coherent whole out of it. So that's kind of one of the issues that we're facing with when legitimising what we do. I think at this point, I hand over to you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Do you want this?
Just this one. So what I'd like to talk about is academic language, which is the focus of what Alex and I are doing a lot. So we're really working on the right-hand side of the diagram, which you just saw, which is the outward-facing aspect of EAP in terms of how it looks at the language of the different disciplines that we are trying to prepare people for. And what we see is that there's a limited operationalization of the dimensions of academic language in EAP practice, and I'm going to say what I mean by that. So there's a whole lot of elements that go into language and discourse which may be there, but are maybe not covered as in the kind of depth that they should be. And the other, the second point is that there's a narrowing focus in terms of the research that's done in EAP these days. And again, I'll talk about what I mean by that in the subsequent slide. So just going back to academic language, some of the limitations around academic language is often what we have to teach in EAP is often governed by a commercial textbook series, which is based on a structural syllabus, which is based on a TESOL model. Now that's quite comfortable for people who are moving into EAP who have been teaching English language maybe for quite some time and who are very familiar with the TESOL model. So when they encounter these kinds of textbooks, they're on very familiar territory, but they do have limitations. There's elements of genre get taught in EAP. The ESP approach to genre, or John Swales's approach, is very commonly used. Move analyses are often used in writing instruction, and there is some use of SFL grammar. And over the few decades that I've been involved in EAP, I feel my feeling is that this is quite eclectic. We take elements of SFL and use it and apply it, and they seem to work in the classroom okay. But while these cover some of the dimensions of academic language, they don't cover all, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. In terms of EAP research, I did a bit of an exercise before we did this talk, and I looked at all of the articles in the Journal of EAP and ESPJ, English for Specific Purposes, over the last 5 years, and looked at what is the focus, what are we looking at here? And I had Ferguson's model in mind, which is the social, epistemological and language dimensions. And what I found was, unsurprisingly, that there was a big focus on language issues because we are involved in teaching the linguistic elements or meeting the linguistic needs of our students, and language issues were the focus of 82% of the ESPJ articles and about 76% of the JEEP articles. I have to say this is just my own analysis. I think it's roughly accurate, but it would need to be validated by somebody else if this was going to be published as an empirical study. Social issues didn't crop up so much in the ESPJ articles, but there was much more of a social focus in the JEEP articles. But the caveat on that is they were often the social focus was the inward-facing focus on the practitioner and on, or maybe on students' learning, aspects of their learning or their student socialisation. The social dimension of the disciplines, so, say if we're teaching in an ESAP situation, received a lot less of a focus. Where I really struggled when I looked through these articles over the 5 years was any focus on epistemology, and I've found roughly some mention of epistemology in 2% of the ESPJ articles, but I have to say it doesn't mean that there was a heavy emphasis. It means it cropped up from time to time in some articles. And with the Jeep articles, I just gave up in the end. I didn't really find any understanding or any particular focus on epistemology in the articles. So why is EAP developing along these lines? Why are there these limitations, or why is it reified or solidified around these certain elements of academic language and discourse, and why does it tend to ignore others? I've just put down some reasons here. These are quite debatable, and some of you might want to challenge me on some of these, but I'll just list them. There is the practitioner-researcher divide, which I think's always been discussed for quite some time. A lot of research is being done, and which often doesn't have close applications to the classroom. John Swales wrote about this in his 2019 article, and a few other people have mentioned it too. I've put narrowing research agendas set by journal editorial boards. Now, I'm on journal editorial boards, and I'm pointing the finger just as much at myself as anyone else here. But often, when a journal advertises the scope of its interest, the area of the breadth of or the diversity of research areas and articles that which get accepted is often much smaller, because it tends to relate to the particular research interests and expertise of the editorial board and people who are regular reviewers. So, and as a result of that, young researchers, people wanting to submit their articles, will tend to look at the citation reports from articles or downloads of articles, and they'll discern what is the particular focus of that journal, and they'll put their own, and they'll find a journal where, if they're doing corpus research, there's a heavy emphasis on corpus, and so they'll send their articles there. So it kind of reinforces this narrowing, if you like, that happens with journals. I think it's a natural function of journals. I don't mean to be particularly critical here. I just think it's just something that happens. Recent bibliographic studies might tend to reinforce this. People put their finger up and see which way the wind's blowing, and see everyone's doing research on this, so this is the area that I should be researching on. Metrics, people look at what's getting the highest scores. I put past luminary culture inherited from TESOL. I think that's maybe less applicable these days, where particularly the topic of this, or the focus of this conference, is very much questioning received wisdom of a small number of people in the past. But one big constraint is where EAP is seen as a commodifiable service, and it's moved into third spaces. In my own university, we had quite a strong in-sessional program, 2 teaching fellows. We had 8 courses. It all got taken off us and put into a non-academic department, and that story is repeated many, many times over. So if we're going to expand our focus on academic language, Ferguson's model, now Ferguson's model was actually a model for ESP, teacher knowledge. It wasn't really, he wasn't really theorizing about language, but I think it's a good place to start, and it just suggests that we could be broadening things out to look at the social, the epistemological, and the philosophical dimensions of language. And so I'm just conscious of time. How are we going here? Yeah, okay. So the social and anthropological dimensions we've worked on in the social theory book that I edited with B. Bond, an area which I think that deserves a lot more attention, and we don't really look at, is epistemology. How knowledge is created and validated in specific disciplines, and my review of the journal articles particularly pointed that out, that gap, and of course disciplinary communication involves discourse and textual practices, which of course there's a huge body of research done, and there's a wealth of material there. But the key word at the top of the frame is it integrates. I think we need to think about a more integrative role of these three dimensions. And the talk I'm giving this afternoon is hopefully will unpack that a little bit and show some work that I've been doing looking at one particular discipline. So the implications of Ferguson's framework is it has huge implications for practitioner formation and knowledge development. I think it forces us to broaden our view, look more widely at what people need to know. When you approach EAP, it reinforces the idea of the huge complexity of what we're trying to do in terms of understanding the texts and discourses of the university and initiate our students into them. And it also has implications for research and practice frameworks in some of these areas which we've listed. I think that there's a huge need for exploration in different topic areas. I'm particularly encouraged that there's at this conference already there's been quite a discussion around needs analysis. I think we need to come back to that, and I think Rob Playfair's work is going to be really significant in that area. So we need a practitioner toolkit that includes knowledge of social theory, epistemological theory, and discourse theory. And those are the things we're looking at. So I think I'll stop there. I think I'm getting the word to stop, and you might like to just finish things off a little bit, Alex.
Okay. Yeah, I'll finish off then. I just want to finish with a final remark about ethics and the role of the practitioner. This, I mean, the way that we present is pretty dry. There's not a lot of jokes in it and things like that. We appreciate that. But this may seem like a kind of intellectualization of EAP. Some people resist that. You know, we haven't mentioned students. We haven't mentioned, you know, I can imagine the coffee conversations. But there is a serious point behind this because Greg Hadley in 2015 had this quite arresting phrase of professional disarticulation. Don't look up disarticulation if you don't know what it means on Google, but it's a kind of dismembering. And it's this sort of leitmotif for EAP practitioners as being slightly at sea. In other words, about their existential role, who they are, what they need to know. And so when you're confronted with career prospects which are vague, private practice, companies involved, all of the sorts of things that generally get discussed here, what we're trying to do, in part, is to establish a knowledge base which is very firm, that allows us to operationalize knowledge at all sorts of different levels, that's expert, that's specialized, that gives us a particular focus in terms of community, identity, and in terms of our own competencies. This will give us, not that we don't have it, but in a stronger way, this gives us a kind of sense of who we are in the university and what we can contribute to it. So this knowledge base is for ethical reasons. It's to be able to enable us to be more confident when we're in the university, to understand the disciplines in a very structured way, and also reflexively to understand the limitations of our own field, to understand where we need to work on our own selves and our own kind of knowledge production. So in a sense, this idea of reducing the gap from the real to the ideal, we all have sentiments about what's wrong with the profession. We have sentiments about what's wrong with academia, but again, it's rather fragmented and fractured. So what we're hoping is this framework allows us to be able to see that our field and the fields we deal with more objectively. In other words, we can objectify the conditions that we work in and the people we work with in order to be able to make the kinds of changes that we feel that we need to make with our own field and with the academics that we work with. So that's kind of what's underpinning this as a motivation. It may not appear at the surface, but all of this work is because we believe very strongly in being able to change the field, but in a principled way that we can produce evidence that we can talk about and that we can argue about. I think we'll stop there. Thank you very much. Thank you.